Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming tonight to this event. Can I remind you please to turn your mobile phones to silent? And when it gets to the Q&A, if you can wait until the microphone gets to you before asking a question for the benefit of our online audience, I'd appreciate it. After the event, the book is on sale here at a special price of £30. And you might, if you're very nice to our speakers, ask them to sign it. And Prestel, the publisher, has provided free drinks for after the event, so please do stick around and get one from the bar. So I'm just going to hand over to the moderator for tonight. It's Monica Allende. She's the picture editor of the Sunday Times magazine, and enjoy the event.
Hello. If you can't hear me, just shout, because sometimes I whisper. So, just want to make sure that, we can all hear what we are going to be discussing here tonight. So, first of all, I'll introduce the panel. Then I'm going to give the voice to Jon Lee Anderson, who is going to be discussing the whole idea, how he tried to define the term and the concept of revolution. Then we will have Ian showing us, Ian Berry, Magnum photographer, showing us a slideshow of his work, and he will be discussing, this particular work. There will be some questions and answers there. Then we will go on to Peter Marlow, who he has prepared a presentation as well of some of his work. There will be some kind of questions. Then we are going to be discussing over 20 minutes the whole idea, a few concepts that I have prepared for tonight, and then we are going to open to the floor Q&A. So we start just introducing, Jon Lee Anderson, who is a writer for The New Yorker, American magazine. I imagine everyone knows the magazine well. He has written extensively in different aspects of conflict photography. I leave it like that, not defined, because that's something that we probably discuss later as well. What is conflict, what is war, what is revolution. Ian Berry, who is a Magnum photographer, and he photographed the apartheid in South Africa, spanned over 3 decades. So this is a project that he keep going back to. It's a project that he was very much there at the beginning, and he saw it all the way through until the end of apartheid. Then Peter Marlow, again, Magnum photographer. He photographed different sort of conflicts around the world. Then he photographed the Zimbabwe and opposition in Zambia, and then he brought this to public attention. At that point, it was not very well known what was happening with the kind of resistance. That work was published here in the Sunday Times magazine. Then he turned his camera home, and then he photographed in the mid-1980s the struggles of the people of Liverpool under the Thatcher years. And that is a project that it was very well, it kind of captivated what was happening over those years. He produced a book called Liverpool Looking Out at Sea. So there are 3 concepts, loose concepts that we want to touch on tonight. And it's the concept of freedom. How do we define freedom? And how do we define freedom today? The idea of aesthetics of conflict photography, how it's evolving, how it has changed maybe from the beginning of the core photographers that set up Magnum to now. And then there is a concept that I'm quite interested in as well, which is a revolutionary performance, and trying to see how social media, how at the moment, this type of revolutionary performance or spontaneous protests are being affected by the social media, or they are not being affected by the social media. So I pass the word to Jon.
Thanks, Monica. Everybody hear me okay? Well, I'm the non-photographer here, and so in a sense, the anomalous character. I was drafted in by Magnum in order to write an essay that would somehow frame the pictures that they were assembling with this concept in mind. As they've done other books, they decided that they had quite a body of work that, loosely speaking, documented revolutions of the last 65 years. Magnum, born on the heels of World War II by a small group of photographers, all of whom had experience in war, went on to photograph themselves. And then as Magnum began to grow, so did the newcomers, a world that was in commotion in the wake of World War II. I think in the one hand, that's what this book does to a degree, although with the frame of struggles for freedom. I found it an interesting exercise because at the time that I was asked to do the essay and to write about this book on revolution, it was still being assembled. It was still in the making. And Magnum being the genial collective that it is, it continued to be assembled over a period of time. And it was a bit like chaos theory, much like revolution itself, I guess. It's something I've documented a fair bit myself, something I've written about, something I've lived in quite a bit as a print journalist, as a writer. And I've worked with a lot of photographers, so I was keen to pair my words to the images that I was seeing. And the whole idea of a visual record of revolution that more than spans my own life, that begins with Magnum. In a sense, the very agency that defines photojournalism in the modern time. In some ways, I suppose we as lay people, in certain cases, probably have Magnum images in mind when we think of certain modern revolutionary moments or episodes, which is an interesting concept. So all of that was in my mind as I sat down and tried to come up with a frame for this movable feast of revolution. And so I began by asking myself, and again, what is a revolution? You know, we were talking about this just before coming up here, and I guess I still have something of an old school idea of what revolution is, which is, going back to the French Revolution or Che Guevara and people like that, where you really shake things up. You alter a society entirely with an ideology. You replace the old society with a new one, for better or worse. And this book encompasses more than that. It encompasses some of what I think we all recognize as the true classic old school revolutions that took place during that period, which would include Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, and several others. Obviously, the Russian Revolution took place before. But then there have been many, many others, which are arguably revolutionary experiences. In each case, these are efforts. Some failed, and some were successful in terms of their ultimate objective of overturning another order and achieving some kind of emancipation for the people that fought for that period in time that was documented by Magnum's photographers. And we see an extraordinary span in this book from the black and white images of the Hungarian Uprising of 1956 through to the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring revolts of the last 2 years. And I think that although in some ways we see an extraordinary similarity in what the nuts and bolts of revolution is, it's people getting out and physically confronting an armed order and that will shoot them down and kill them, and they perhaps need to be killed in order to be overturned. We now live in a time in which something Monica mentioned or alluded to, this idea of revolutionary performance. I think it's something a lot of us that covered the rebellion in Libya saw, and we've seen in a number of ways in recent years. We now live in a time when everything is so photographed that even youngsters who go out onto the streets, and I think this began some years ago, have some photographic knowledge, have some visual record or sensibility of what a revolution should look like, or a revolutionary should look like. And you know, and I think so in the age of photography, as these revolts, as these experiences have been documented, they have in turn nourished and fed subsequent generations of photographable events and revolutions. And we now see, I'll never forget being in Libya and seeing who really looked the part. And if you talk to them, they would tell you that, you know, that they got their belt, you know, the beret was to look like Che, the black jeans were because they were cool, and they were new hipster revolutionaries after all, not old school. And some of them had learned how to fire their anti-aircraft batteries by playing video games. I'm thinking of one in particular who literally, that was how he learned. So we're now living in a time where not just the visual, but the experience of sort of citizenship in the modern world, which is such a media experience, is informing everything, including the actions taken in battlefields. And in some cases, it is like the performance of war, the ritualization of war and of revolution. In a sense, this isn't anything new. We have more information. But if you go back to tribal battles in former times, before cameras, there was a ritualization of warfare as well, and of performance in battle. It's always been there. What's interesting is to see the part that photography, which is, after all, the essence of this project, has played in that. And so, well.
Do you think there is something beyond the aesthetics? I get it that, you know, there are sort of imagery that is very appealing. That could be a young sort of a protester, and then you get the whole gear. But do you think there is sort of ideology, there is a sense of why they are there beyond the aesthetics?
Oh yeah. But I mean, I think, and we could debate entirely about the definition of revolution. I would argue that a real revolution is only one that actually overturns society. I think we could argue that what happened in Libya wasn't so much a revolution as it was a rebellion. You could say the same about Syria. There would be people that would argue with me about that. I'm sure that within the people fighting against Assad right now, or who fought against Gaddafi in Libya, there are those who were always very clear on what kind of society they wanted afterwards. But most of the youngsters, who mostly they were young, who were in the field fighting, were doing so out of a feeling of grievance with the regime, a kind of coming together. It was a social phenomena which they became infected with and a part of. For a lot of young men, it's a coming of age experience. At a certain point, it's the fulcrum on which society turns, and you have to join, or you're not a man. You know, you can no longer belong.
I mean, in the way
I don't want to, over sort of pop psych it. It's. I don't think that we can judge revolutions through our observation of the photographs of it entirely. I think they are what they are. And what we are seeing, though, is an extraordinary upheaval that's taken place around the world in which old orders are being overturned, not necessarily for better in some cases. And the most extraordinary thing about it, of the time we live in, and which I think this book also shows in its chronology, is that everything, but everything, is documented. There's an image of everything. And I wrote this essay which attempted to look at the history of revolution, which talked about Magnum's role with revolution over the past 65 years, and also about the evolution of photography. And I ended up with an image in my own mind of Gaddafi being tortured and brutalized and finally killed on YouTube, effectively. First in a series of stills and then video clips that we all saw and probably can never get out of our minds again. And this was an example of, you know, how much the world and the world that you two have also documented is changing before our eyes, in which, what is the role of a photojournalist? There were no photojournalists at that particular moment in Sirte. They were around Sirte. They had been working hard and valiantly, in some cases, at great risk, photographing the fighting leading up to the fall of Sirte. The capture and killing of Gaddafi took place some miles within the town on the other outskirts, and his execution, his brutalization, his execution took place before our eyes, almost in real time, but in the hands of amateurs who were nonetheless keen to document it and to share it. And the fact that this now occurs everywhere in the world with almost anything you can possibly imagine alters the way I think we consider the phenomena of our time, and and also poses a challenge to, I think, to us in terms of thinking about how, you know, what's the role of photojournalism in the future. Is it the same? I would argue in a sense that it is. Why not? If you're in love or obsessed with a particular story, you want to document it, then you do it, irrespective of what else is being done. But I'm sure that there might be many differing points of view. And obviously there's many technical means to do things in different ways.
I wanted to touch very quickly on what you are differentiating between revolution and rebellion. For you, it seems you will categorize the Arab Spring as rebellion. Is because the voices, you don't see that they are unified behind one ideology, and revolution for you in traditional terms before is like you could see sort of a group with an identity with one unified ideology. Is that the difference for you?
No. I mean, the Russian Revolution took place over a number of years, and finally became the sweeping revolution that it was, as was China's, as was Cuba's, but the Russian Revolution took place over a period of time in which its change was not complete until, you know, the Bolsheviks took power and were able to completely alter the human landscape in that country. It was the same in Cuba, it was the same in Iran, it was the same in Nicaragua. Not necessarily all of them were long-lasting. But, for instance, I think we think of Iran was a revolution because it completely altered that country's landscape 30 years ago. And to this day, it's a different society. Not everybody was in favor of it, but that's what happened.
And a rebellion?
Was Tiananmen Square a revolution? It's in the book. It was an uprising. It was a struggle for freedom, which is loosely how this book has been defined. But it was unsuccessful. China today is a country defined by, you know, state capitalism and the privation of individual freedom still in the political sense.
But it did change in a way, because it didn't change politically, but then basically what the Communist Party decided is to open the hand a little bit.
Yeah, but not as a result of Tiananmen Square.
But they
had taken the decision before. And, you know, Cuba's undergoing that change now as well. But they already had the revolution. Would we now define this as a new revolution? No, it's not. Was what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed a revolution and it became a thugocracy? It's interesting. But I think these are all fascinating and really valid debating points. I don't have a kind of.
Would you say Cambodia was a revolution?
I would.
Yeah.
I would. We were
Why-
talking about
why?
that before, and it's not considered one because, and I think it's because, to my mind, what Pol Pot did was the most extreme form of utopianism, of utopian idealism. This idea of, he finally seized power. He and his Khmer Rouge seized power. What did they do? They marched the people from the city into the countryside. They had a very clear vision of what they want to do. It involved necessarily killing hundreds of thousands of people in order to create a new race. That was arguably a revolutionary experiment. It was an apocalyptic one. It was a devastating one, but it was arguably a revolutionary experience. I think anyway.
We will
Yeah.
come back to it in the discussion a little
I think
bit later.
everybody's very keen to see.
But we are going to have a look at Ian's pictures now, and you want to run us through them?
Yeah. Hey, look, as you said, anything Magnum does is going to be chaotic. And I've photographed half a dozen revolutions, not the Russian one, I have to say, believe it or not. And somehow I wound up in this book with South Africa, which has to be the longest running revolution ever. It was kind of fascinating for me because I arrived in South Africa as a kid, and just before it became a republic. And it was a little bit weird and rather surreal for me because it became a republic after all these years on a wet, rainy day, and it was done in a couple of hours. It was kind of nothing. And so I was stuck there, actually having to move on and try and do something photographically. And if I can make this gadget work, am I pointing it the wrong way? Maybe.
Pointed to this.
The right-hand side.
Which way? That way or
Holding
this
the
way?
other way up. That's
There
way.
you go. There you go.
So I just included in this a couple of pictures from when I arrived. And I arrived as a kid, and this was the sentiment of the majority of the whites, I have to say, not just the Afrikaners. And afterwards, sorry, I'm afraid this is going to be a little bit chaotic. And this was Republic Day, and really not for me a memorable day at all. And so I started to shoot in South Africa, and things started to warm up politically. There were sort of riots in the township, and as you said, most of these things, one way or another, are tribal. And the South Africans divided. Soweto is built on tribal lines. There's an area for Xhosas, an area for Zulus, and so on. And most of the police were Zulus. So although you had a political demonstration, the white police could quite happily set the Zulus on the ANC party, the majority of which they were Xhosas. And then came the past burning, and the first signs, if you like, of what I thought was going to be a revolution. And Sharpeville happened. It was a dreadful occasion. 70-odd people were killed. I wound up being the only guy there for reasons I won't bore you with, and in those days I just had a Leica with a wide-angle lens, and so I got down in the grass, and I thought that after this, things were really going to happen in South Africa. It seemed to me that the big change was about to come, one way or another. And for a few weeks, the government panicked, and somehow they picked up the reins again. And I just kind of went on shooting for a while. This was a kid whose house had been burned down the day before, and I just loved the way that he accepted the reality of life. He suddenly had no life, but he had an oil can guitar, and he made quite a nice shape with the And then slowly, whites started for the first time to be slightly involved with the Africans. I just don't see many Africans here, so I don't know whether there are any South Africans. But on the fringes of Johannesburg, you had these cafes, and a few whites would sort of turn up, although it was illegal for them to be there. And the guy in the background is white, but I wasn't really thinking in those terms at that point. I was just documenting what was going on. This, for me, was a big turning point in my sort of attitude to South Africa. It suddenly occurred to me, I mean, you know, I was there as a white kid and I mixed with the whites. However, I'd gone to work for a black magazine, not for any idealistic or political reasons. I'm fairly apolitical. But an editor came out to this magazine called Tom Hopkinson, who had worked for an edited picture post, and I thought there was a lot to be learned. And so I started to work for this magazine. And I took this photograph, and I started to think, what interested me about South Africa? And actually, the interesting thing for me were the relationships, not just between black and white, but between English-speaking, Afrikaner-speaking, between African and colored, between colored and Indian. And so I set out over a period, and going back for different magazines, to try to show the feeling. And the only way I could do it, more or less, was on the street. Everybody came to South Africa, showed a tea party in a southern suburbs house, white house, and with the African servant pouring tea. And to do a little bit more than that was very difficult, because you could really only do it on the street, because that was the only time and place that black and white met. And this is in front of the Johannesburg City Hall, and I was just a little bit charmed by this African beggar who, given the conditions in South Africa, was still able to wave to this white kid going by. So one tried to, I tried to extend this. This was at a wine tasting in the Cape, and the colored workers were bringing on crates of wine to keep the whites sort of glasses full, to keep them happy. And I noticed it was rather amusing, because every third crate that arrived disappeared behind a tent. And so by the end of the wine tasting, not only the workers were pissed, but most of the whites were as well. But it just gave me a feel of what this guy felt about the whites. This, I knew at this point that it was finished for the whites in South Africa. They had, in Cape Town, there were beaches, believe it or not, for whites, for coloreds, for Africans, for Indians. This was a white beach. And I was walking along it. I saw this white couple, walking along hand in hand. And suddenly this African couple came cavorting by. And so I waited until they went by, shot the picture. You know, it's one of those things, you see it coming. And I thought the white guy, if he did go and thump one of the black guys, would at least swear at them. Not a word, ignored them. And I thought, this really is going to be the end of the politics. So the English-speaking whites got religion for the first time. They were no more religious than the English are in this country. But suddenly they were all going to church. And the oldest African, or the biggest African religion in South Africa is the Zion Christian Church. And they believe in full baptism, full submersion, immersion. I thought they were going to drown them, but the only person who nearly got drowned was me, who was up to my waist in water. I don't know whether we've mostly got photographers or journalists. I don't know what we have here. But anyone who's a photographer will recognize the oddity in this picture. A then colleague of mine, Jim Naftwey, was next to me, and it was just about going dark. And he was shooting with flash, and I was shooting available light. And I was using a Leica, and the shutter goes across. And I picked up half his flash, which created this odd sort of apologies to any journalists. But I don't normally go for this sort of picture, but I thought it was a bit of fun. Okay, what happened as the end came near is that the police would shoot somebody in the townships. There would be a funeral. The ANC would turn up to politicize the funeral. This was a funeral of a 14-year-old girl who'd been shot by the police. And this guy in front, or the people around, are actually ANC guys giving the ANC salute. And what would happen was the crowd would get worked up, the police would shoot somebody else, the next week there'd be another funeral, and somewhat that's how it went on. This was also African women at the funeral. Then Bishop Tutu would come along to these funerals and try and sort of calm the situation, so that no one else would get shot. And he did a pretty good job, I have to say. He was then Bishop Tutu, and I gradually sort of got to know him then. And, this was a different funeral, and a police car turned up and tried to drive through the procession. There were 3 African policemen in the car, and of course the crowd thought it was rather impolite of them to drive through the procession, so they turned the car over, and one of the policemen legged it across the field, got caught immediately and was killed. The second guy also went across the field, and I chased him, and by the time I caught up, he'd been necklaced. And this was his body was already burning, and I shot a couple of frames, and an African friend of mine, Peter Magabane, said, "This is the time to go," and we left rather smartly after that. Okay, so what you had was a right-wing government and the AWB party, which was kind of ultra-right-wing. This was at an Afrikaner monument, the Voortrekker monument. And these ladies, who were called a Kapi Commando, were protesting about the liberal policies of the right-wing government. I mean, you know, Genghis Khan had nothing on these ladies. I was a bit younger then, and I rather fancied the one on the right. And I tried to chat her up, not expecting much in English. I learned a whole slew of Anglo-Saxon expletives in a very, very quick time. And I didn't get anywhere at all, I'm afraid. The police, I went around with them for a couple of nights in the squad car. And I had to read the A to Z because neither of the policemen in the front could read the A to Z of Johannesburg. So I had to help them out. And we stopped occasionally to harass locals. This guy, I think, had been arguing with his wife or something and was getting a full-time lecture. For the first time, poor whites started to get involved in food handouts. One's seen this in different parts of the world, obviously, but for whites in South Africa, this was rather odd. Especially as some of them didn't really look as though they were short of food, but there you go. I was driving back up from the Cape to Johannesburg, and I stopped off at this farm, and the coloured workers on the farm, they had half a dozen huts, and they had one tap between them, which was okay. They got their water from this tap. But when the farmer needed the water, he cut off this one tap. And so people were drinking out of this polluted stream. And actually this picture set me up onto my next project after South Africa. Central Johannesburg became a pretty well no-go area for whites. And I saw this guy coming through the crowd, and I could sense his fear at being amongst an African crowd in downtown Joburg. And I just thought, a bit dodgy to be carrying flowers in that part of Joburg. Well, this was a bit of fun. For the first time, the AWB, the right wing, had a confrontation with the slightly less right-wing police. And this happened at night. And what happened was everybody, of course, had masks, both sides, and the cops set the dogs on the AWB, and in this case, the dog very smartly ripped the trousers off this guy, and it could all have been a bit of fun. But actually what happened was, after this, the AWB dispersed to the center of town, and they were totally pissed off. And a passing African taxi going through, they opened fire on the taxi and shot the 3 people in the taxi, killed people in the taxi. And that's kind of how it was just prior to the elections. I went to an extreme right-wing AWB, sorry, no, this is not. This is a National Party conference. Most white kids in South Africa grow up with an African nanny, usually up to the age of about 4-ish. And this kid was obviously quite a bit older, but still attached to this nanny, who was the only black person at this political rally, and quite obviously not enjoying it at all. But the white kid was still bizarrely hanging on. This was just before the elections, and the Zulu Inkatha Party was at this time anti-ANC. The ANC, the usual tribal scene, the ANC were mostly Xhosas and other tribal groups, but the Zulus under Buthelezi were standing against them. This was a Zulu impi. I thought, I was by myself on this road in a car, on a dirt road, and I'd just come from photographing a fight between Zulus and the ANC. And I saw this crowd coming down the hill towards me, and I kind of thought, do I just turn around and shove off? Or do I wait and see what they're up to? Anyway, they came by. This guy very obligingly waved his sticks at me, and on they went. It didn't worry me at all. And I asked one of the ladies, and actually, to ruin the story, they were on their way to a wedding. So there'd be no danger to me whatsoever. Okay, I followed Mandela around just before the elections. I think I arrived about a month before the elections, and I think my press pass was 300 and something. There were hundreds of photographers, news people, and most of the speeches that he gave, they were in football fields. And so you spent your time photographing him, the camera above your head, a million other photographers in the background. You took the picture, he came by, you ran around, took another picture. A total non-event. But I was ahead of him going to a university, and I saw this poster, and I kind of thought, this is kind of a bit more interesting than actually photographing him with 100 photographers. And I think, you know, we're always looking for something a little bit different. And this picture became a little bit symbolic afterwards. immediately before the elections, bearing in mind Africans had never voted before, and so there were classes for them to learn how to vote. And one of the things as a photographer you never do is to include any sort of signage in the picture, because, you know, if you're trying to sell this picture in Spain, no one is going to speak English and know what use the ballot is going to be about. However, I thought it filled in the hole in the shape of this picture, and this young African was shouting at the soldiers. The day before the election, the whole of central Joburg, they covered off all the main buildings with razor wire, and the army were inside in case there was any rioting. But it all went off relatively peacefully, and the actual voting day had to be extended. People queued from dawn, they were still queuing at night for the experience of voting. Sorry. On election night, Mandela celebrating, a great celebration in Joburg. After the following day, I stuck around, and this was in the township, and this guy was roaring drunk, but delighted that, that, you know, the ANC had won the election. I went down to Cape Town, and I quite like the symbolism of this, because if this guy had tried to chat up this coloured lady before the elections, he would have been arrested and in jail before his feet touched the ground. But afterwards, of course, things had changed, and I rather like the combination of the guy and the woman and the symbolism of the twisted barrel of the gun. For the first time, whites begging on the streets in Johannesburg, rather a sad scene. And I went back, for the Telegraph magazine, to do something on Tutu, Archbishop by now, with his white gardener who looked after the roses for him in his in the cathedral in Cape Town, and then he himself during a service. Good value actually, Tutu. He's a really good guy for photographers. He doesn't sort of mess about. You can photograph him, and he's quite happy to do it. And I kind of hoped at that point that this was going to be the upside of South Africa. I have to say, I haven't included any pictures, but I went back a couple of years ago to for Paris Match to shoot the white farmers in the north of the Transvaal, the name of which has changed now, which is just below the Zimbabwe border. And the white farmers, you know, for whom I don't have any particular affection, but they are being killed, they're having their farms confiscated. It's a bit like Zimbabwe. The interesting thing was that the story ran, of course, in France and around Europe. No one would run it in this country because it was not to show that South Africa wasn't the ideal utopia that we all hope for. I'm kind of hoping that they'll make it out, but one has to have reservations, I feel. All right, that's it from South Africa.
I have a quick question for Ian about Drum magazine. You went to work for Drum very early on. This is the magazine he was referring to, that the main audience is non-white, and you always sort of say it's not for political reasons. At that time, it's referred to in the book that they thought you must have been a communist, if they want some kind of extreme alliance. But I'm interested to know if it really changed your perception. It changed your access. I mean, suddenly you were working for the non-white audience. You were working in a non-white magazine. So the access to the subjects, it must have been different, and your perception was changing because of working for Trump?
It changed for two reasons. One, because whenever I was in a situation, the white cops would threaten to beat me up, and frequently did. And I guess the thing that really brought it home to me was that traveling with an African reporter, we'd go out and we'd work, shoot on a story, and in the evening, I'd be dropped off in a white hotel, and he'd have to go off to the township to find somewhere to sleep. I mean, we couldn't even go into a cafe and have a cup of tea together. And also, it fell to me and Tom Hopkinson, our reporters got arrested regularly because they had to have a pass wherever they had to be. And of course, working on stories, they never had a pass that permitted them to be in a particular area. So they got arrested, and they'd be chucked in prison. And Tom and I would go along the next day to bail them out, and I would go really to photograph them because invariably they got beaten up. And so I went along to take pictures of the bruises and God knows what. But it was a real eye-opener for me. I mean, you know, as I said earlier, I'm not political really, I'm pretty apolitical, and one of my philosophies as a photographer is not really to take sides. A lot of photographers will say these days that's crap. You know, you go along with a point of view and you pursue the point of view. I don't. I try and go along with an open mind. Obviously, you've done your research, and you know, you have an idea of where your sympathies lie, but you kind of have to look, I think, at both sides. And doing this in South Africa was a pretty tricky thing to do without becoming very biased.
Were there many whites working in drum at that time?
The backroom staff were mostly whites. The two photographers were Peter Magabane, an African photographer who went on to work for Time, and myself. And I was paid twice as much as he was. And that kind of really irritated me. You know, it was run by a guy who was very idealistic, and he ran this magazine, which was great, you know, to start up. We could do stories on farm labor, I mean anti-stories on farm labor. I went along to do a story on the churches. I went with a few Africans into a white church, and I stayed and took pictures, and they got thrown out. And I stayed to talk to the clergyman, the dominie, and he didn't say a word. He just flattened me over the back of the pew. He was a good sort of rugby front row forward, and I was fair game, and he just flattened me. He wouldn't say anything. But we could never touch the mines, because the owner of the magazine, his money, his father's money, was based on the mines. So we could never do any anti-mine stories. And finally, I had a row with him, and Hopkinson did because of this, and we both quit.
How many years in drum altogether?
I was there for a very short time, about 18 months. That was all. Yeah.
Thank you. Peter?
Hi, thanks, Ian. That was a very impressive masterclass in how to do a slideshow.
Not to do it, whichever way you look at it.
I feel slightly here under false pretenses because I've only got a very few pictures in the book, i.e. one. And it's basically represented, it's really it's the first story I ever did, the first serious story I ever did. So this was the struggle for, well, what I call the struggle for Zimbabwe in 1977. I shot this. And I just thought a good place to start is just to kind of evoke that era. You know, we said we were allowed to talk for 10 minutes, and it's kind of difficult to, you know, we both worked as photographers for many, many years. So it was sort of difficult to get my head round how I was going to present this, but I've got the back of an envelope, so it should be all right. So these were some of the press passes I had. I joined an agency called Sigma in 1977 and worked with them for about 3 years. So what's interesting is the bottom right-hand side is a page from my passport that my daughter, who was then 3, decided she was going to destroy because she wanted to stop me travelling. She used to get very upset about me going away. So that was the life. I'm sure it's the life Jon Lee's to a certain extent, you know, on the road. So these are some of the passes. So to sort of evoke that era, this was some of the kind of things I was doing. Mrs. Thatcher, this is published in The Guardian quite recently. Mrs. Thatcher at the Tory party conference where she made her famous speech, "The Lady's Not for Turning." This was in 1977, Trafalgar Square. There was this was in Parry Match. I think 3 or 4 people died. I worked quite a bit in Israel and the Middle East. This was New York Times. Which ended up on the cover of about settlers. This was the Lewisham riots in 1977, where there was the action against the National Front. The Gdansk shipyard strike, which was in '82. This is Walesa after this was an incredible story because the negotiations that they were doing with the government was actually because the communist system was so connected up. All the factories were connected up on a kind of PA system to, you know, transmit communist propaganda. So the the strikers in the factory actually turned this to their advantage, and so the whole negotiation with the representatives of the government was actually done and was actually broadcast to the whole of Poland, including trawlers in the North Sea and the Baltic. It was absolutely extraordinary, and people were just lying on the grass, just listening to these negotiations. Finally, they got an agreement. Walesa went to the gates of the shipyard with the pen he got as a souvenir from the Pope's first trip to Poland, which he signed the agreement, and there he is on the gate. Did a lot of work in Northern Ireland. This is the New York Times. This was Life magazine. I mean, Ian was actually there, I think, you were in Prague in '68?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, this is 10 years after, and it was a piece for the Telegraph magazine about 10 years after the revolution, Husak. And then I did a series, towards the end of the 70s, early 80s, I did a lot of feature stories for the Sunday Times magazine. This was, we did a series on mega cities. I worked with Philip Knightley. This was in Nigeria. And then I put this in, this is the revolution in the Philippines, 1983, because one of the sort of ad hoc committee we had in Magnum said, it's a real shame we didn't get the Philippines yesterday. This is Abbas talking to me yesterday. We had no pictures of the revolution now kicking out Marcos. And I suddenly thought, hang on, I was there. So I had to dig around the archive today and came up with a couple of pictures. This is in when Aquino came back to Manila in August '83. They against the advice of everybody, opposition leader. He was assassinated as he got off the plane, and there was fairly major riots in the city. This is in Manila, and I'll just go back to that. But I remember, if you can see, there's a water cannon behind, and I got a tremendous amount of help, which you do when you are travelling, from local photographers. And we all got our big hankies out, ready for the tear gas. And we went, they said, come with us. And we went to the water cannon, and the police, the army, did a little dribble out of the water cannon so we could wet our handkerchiefs to put over our faces. But then the riot started, and this poor guy that got caught, we probably never came out of jail. I mean, it was very, very violent and very unforgiving. And this was, I was looking for something about, I'm sure we're going to talk about the approach the photographers had in those days. I went with Philip Knightley to the Philippines, and we used to present stories in the Sunday Times magazine on a projector, a Kodak carousel. You'd shoot in Kodachrome, you'd go somewhere with about 1/4 inch thick of traveller's checks and your passport, and sort of the brief was come back with a story. I mean, those days are gone, they're never going to come back, so let's just enjoy the memory. But so the presentation to the art director, Michael Randon, the editor, would always be on a Kodak carousel which had 80 pictures in. So you'd always think, well, I need at least 60 pictures to be able to sit in that dark room and make this presentation to the editor. So I'd kind of keep a little record here of what I felt I had.
So these are references of your...
They're references, yeah. So,
that would be each frame there?
Yeah, and well, they're things that stand out in your mind, whereas today, of course, these are just rolls of film in a bag that become more and more precious the longer the story lasts, because so there is a very different way of working now, and everything's so immediate, which I think is fantastic, because in 20, 30 years ago, you really, I went to earthquakes and stayed for less than a day because I had to come back and get the film back. So I mean, it does liberate the photographers, all this new technology. Anyway, sorry. So anyway, we're going on to the Rhodesia evolving into Zimbabwe. And the story, this is what is in the book. The story begins at the Savoy Hotel with the leader of ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo, who I met in, must have been about 76. I was very politically engaged in those days. First thing I did when I went to university was join the Communist Party, and in Freshers' Week. And so I wanted to do something about the struggle for in what was then Rhodesia. And I met Nkomo, and I said, listen, what I can do for you is I can pack up a darkroom and take it to Lusaka, to where you're based, and teach some of your people how to take pictures and how to to help him with the propaganda campaign. This was slightly later. This is Mugabe and Nkomo in 78, the Lancaster House Agreement, where they signed an agreement for so-called free elections in what was then Rhodesia. Lord Carrington in the middle. Sorry, I'm pointing the wrong way. This is after Ian Smith. I mean, you probably know the history of this better than me, but Ian Smith declared UDI, Universal Declaration of Independence, against the wishes of the British government. The United Nations issued sanctions for a few years, and then eventually they patched it up, and Abel Muzorewa became the interim Prime Minister. I think that's correct. So here he is with the British Foreign Secretary, David Owen, before the elections. So anyway, I finally get to Lusaka with my suitcase darkroom, and I sit around. I seemed to spend a lot of time sitting around not doing very much, because I knew I wanted to get into these camps. I knew that I think probably what Ian Smith didn't know, there was a huge sort of there were refugee camps outside the borders of Rhodesia, and they were, training and ready to take over. And I had this naive idea that I could go over the border with them. I mean, it was never ever going to happen. But I did finally, after, I think for 2 weeks I lived on avocados because it was the only thing I could afford to buy. And I did eventually persuade Nkomo to let me visit three of the refugee camps. So I went to the first camp we got to. We drove in a Land Rover, and Nkomo got on the roof, and all these boys came out of the forest. They'd literally been sleeping under trees, and looked up at us. I was standing next to Nkomo, and then he just said one word, Zimbabwe, and everybody went, everybody went Z, like this. It was like total destruction. And it was an incredible sight. And so I photographed it. And then we saw, and then there's some general pictures within the camp. These boys, they just really had nothing. And what they did with, they improvised these weapons using the sort of branches of trees, which they, with the food aid, came in tins, and they created these knives out of the tins. There was US aid, mealie meal was provided in polythene sacks. So they used the polythene, melted it down to stick the wooden guns together. Here we are again. There was one boy who had a real AK, who was one of the camp guards. There's a big attempt at education there. This is a girls' camp. And Nkomo said this is one of the men's camps. And this is Nkomo on the Land Rover we travelled in. He also wanted me. He set this up for me. I felt a bit uncomfortable taking the picture, and it'd been used quite a bit. Amnesty recently used it on a calendar, but it was completely set up picture. But I took it anyway. The work was published in the Sunday Times magazine. Thank you, and I think it created quite a stir at the time because nobody realized how many people were actually on the border ready to, act when the time came. This was published in Newsline, which was Workers' Revolutionary Party organ. And I was also published in Drum, which I think was then based in Nairobi. It must have been the last vestiges of that magazine.
Office there, yeah.
Okay, and interestingly, on the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an Italian publisher from Bologna, Arte, published a whole book using that one picture. So this is the picture of the boys waving at the sound of Zimbabwe, and then sections of the image are taken and linked with various articles from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
How many pages, this book?
I think it was 50 pages, and they created. It came with the photograph cut up, which was the number of images in the book, and they created 1,800 posters and 100,000 cards, sent them to people to write on, to make messages and to draw on, and then these were reassembled and exhibited. It was a nice idea. And then we come on to, so that was in 1977, and I suppose I would have liked to have put in a sort of transition project here to show why I decided to sort of move away from news photography in that conventional sense. I basically thought, you know, I was quite good at producing the nice defining news moments for double-page spreads in magazine, but something I felt was missing. I think what I felt was missing was just as you know, a sense of being myself as a photographer, a sense of authorship, and joining Magnum I joined in about 1980, but I heard that photographers could do what they wanted and not what they were told to do. So it kind of appealed. I remember in the Sigma days when you know, you used to get very excited about things being published, and having to doorstep Lord Snowden somewhere in Kensington because he'd announced he was going to get married to someone else, and I arrived there. He was walking down the street and he said to me, "What do you want? It's all over, all the pictures were yesterday." And I wanted to say to him, "Listen, did you see the Sunday Times at the weekend? Because I had this stuff in, but I didn't." So that was a kind of feeling that sort of took me away from Sigma, because it just seemed to be a place where I couldn't really express my own feelings as a photographer. So I've chosen this project, which is shot in 1999 during what the Serbians would call NATO aggression, what we would call the Kosovo crisis. But again, it's so this is I spent. It was an 11-week bombing campaign by NATO to try to kick Milosevic out of Kosovo, and his sort of, to put it lightly, his heavy-handed treatment of the Albanian, Kosovan Albanians, leading to the point where 230,000, a quarter of a million people were displaced, huge atrocities. He goes down as the one leader in history who was indicted by The Hague during his period of office. I think he's the only one. So I went out I was very late on the story, and the point was, I began to think that, you know, I would have liked to have put in, like I said, some kind of transition project here which showed how the approach changed. But I realized after a while that I could actually shoot pictures without things going on. And it gave me a tremendous sense of freedom, because I didn't really need the standard toolbox of the photojournalist, which is, you know, juxtapositions, lots of meaning in the pictures. And I tried to concentrate more on just looking and seeing, you know, just seeing what was in front of the camera. And that was incredibly liberating. And it was, you know, it's something that has sustained me ever since. So I kind of took that approach on the road, and with the American fleet in Kosovo, in the Adriatic during the Kosovo War, these are some of the pictures I took.
How long were you on the ship?
I went on about 5 ships over a period of a week, so a very short time. But I didn't wake up in the morning worried about what I was going to photograph. I just basically photographed whatever I saw. And for instance, these are Navy SEALs on the back of the Theodore Roosevelt training. I took a picture of them, and a guy came up to me, grabbed one of my cameras and threw it over the side. And I said, you know, I really couldn't believe it. And I said, "Can I speak to your commanding officer, please?" And so I did. And I explained what happened. He said, "You got a problem with that, sir?" And so as I walked off with one Mamiya 6 instead of two, I turned back and I thought, I'll take a picture anyway, so I did. Later on, I got them again because they didn't see me. They were on one of the flight decks and I was on the edge of the deck. This guy is called the Air Boss and was controlled the aircraft traffic on the deck. And it was interesting. They all seemed to look like Paul Newman.
They were posing for the picture.
Maybe, but yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It was when Milosevic marched out of Kosovo, they were hardly touched. They got all this. I was fascinated by the technology, but it wasn't actually that effective when you think about it. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of Kosovan Albanians came back to their country, which was they were in the majority. There were only 10% Serbs, but to me, it was, here we go. Here's the flight deck on the Theodore Roosevelt, and it's a bit like playing it's playing a game almost. An F-16 pilot in what's called the paraloft, where they go before they go up on deck. He was listening to AC/DC, and they had Grease on the one of the video screens, because he said, I've got 20 minutes on the deck with the engine running and I need to get fired up. So, and he carried a pistol. Quite know what he was going to do with that, I don't know. They had about 17 different types of ketchup, and this is a bingo night on the nuclear aircraft carrier. Theodore Roosevelt, I got on this ship and I said, well, where's the reactor? Can I have a look? And so, it was in a spirit of curiosity. There was no assignment. It wasn't, I suppose it wasn't an expensive story to do. I just showed up in Italy and managed to get, you would hardly call it embedding. My room was under the flight deck, and they were on 24-hour, 24/7 bombing. It was impossible to sleep. So basically, their regard for journalists was fairly low. The only place you could have a cigarette was by where they kept the anchor, which they called the crack house. So, but happily, I'd given up smoking after that. But there's morning prayers. There's a Marine doing his ironing on a Marine, what looked like an aircraft carrier, apparently wasn't, called this Kearsarge. And this was on an EFIS cruiser called the Leyte Gulf, and it's in this area called Combat Information, which, if you're a fan of Star Trek, it just reminded me of it completely. I mean, I'm being a bit flippant here, but the technology was unbelievable. This line of desks here was called Air Alley, and they were talking to all the pilots they all sounded like Stephen Hawking. It's all encrypted, and then the radar would show the symbols represent different kinds of aircraft. They'd established a no-fly zone, so they were running decoys, refueling, that kind of thing. So I was kind of really interested in the detail. Can you please show me the button that you press when you launch a cruise missile? And here it is. It's the final button of a very, very detailed sequence, which obviously has loads of checks and balances. And the final button says execute underneath. And this is the captain of the Leyte Gulf having a haircut. And then obviously the grooming standards are fairly extreme. Everyone had to report to their commanding petty officer or NCO at 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, you've probably seen this. And if they were 1 second late, 1 minute late, it was 2 days on bread and water in the brig, which is the prison on the ship. So very, very harsh discipline. And this is Harrier pilot on the Kearsarge arriving back, having bombed targets in Serbia. That's it.
Thank you. Because we overran a little bit with the preliminary discussions, I want to open the floor to questions now, and then we will kind of fill some gaps ourselves with conversations. So I just think that I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, and we can address those rather than running out of time completely. And we have Susan Meiselas waving there. Paolo Pellegrin there. That they have a lot. Oh, that they have a lot of questions.
Should be up here.
Yes.
You guys should be up here.
Come and join us.
Yes.
Come.
I just wanted to ask, how did you make yourself unseen? Because in most of the photographs, I realized that it looked like the people were completely unaware of you. And I'm just curious, how did you manage that? Because you're obviously not one of them.
Is this for me?
Yes.
I'm a master of disguise, actually. You know, you just be as unobtrusive as you can. And also, as a rather weedy-looking Brit with longish hair, I wasn't taken for an Afrikaner. And if you weren't an Afrikaner, you were kind of considered to be on the African side. So I was fine with the Africans, but not so fine with the whites. Mostly I photographed Africans, it was easier.
Question for Ian. Don McCullen, sorry. Thank you. Don McCullen just went to Syria. I don't know if you know, but on the front of the Times today. And him going there, does that get you in the mood to go and do something similar? Or would you, at your age, do what he's just done?
If somebody paid me, yes. But you know, the truth is that nobody's going to pay me to go to Syria these days. Or indeed, nobody's really going to pay anybody, except maybe Time magazine, to go to Syria. So, you know, you travel the world at your own expense these days.
Sure. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, Ian, you have you photographed apartheid over 3 decades. What was that constant, what was in you that you wanted to kind of come back and keep coming back? Were you hoping for a completion of the project? When you wanted to see the end of it? I mean, photographers these days, I mean, you're referring to money and you're referring to the idea that, well, who is going to pay you? But you kept at it. You have that kind of continuity. It kind of really defined you very much as a photographer. I mean, what was in you that you wanted to see the end of it and be there to the end?
I guess the glib answer would be, it was fun, and it's better than working. But I know you're always looking for the definitive situation, the definitive picture. It's a challenge, and I go on doing it as long as the situation, the subject is interesting. You go on bashing around the world in the hope of either producing a long-term, shooting a long-term project for yourself. But it becomes very expensive. I mean, I'm doing a project now which takes me around the world, but I'm going to Timbuktu for one picture. And by the time you've done that half a dozen times, you're running out of money. And you know what it is. It's hard to persuade picture editors to put up any money.
But I think what we're referring to about South Africa is just it's almost like it was something in you that you wanted to kind of, you didn't decide in, end of the 60s, said, well, that's it, I'm not going to continue. You kind of kept at it until very much it came to that kind of freedom moment, that moment that, the elections and apartheid comes to an end.
Well, the difference with South Africa for me was that, any other sort of revolutions or that type of thing, Congo or Katanga or Ghana or Prague or wherever, you were usually on assignment. I went to Prague and I was the only guy that got in. And I had it more or less to myself for 4 days, but I had to get out to meet the Paris-Match deadline. Unfortunately, there was a guy there called Kudelka who lived there. I came across this lunatic for the first time there, who was there for the whole thing. And now I think you've got to be there for the whole thing. And South Africa was obviously going to change. It was obviously going to come to an end. And I went on shooting there. I hoped to go on shooting there until that moment when I saw it as the end. Of course it isn't. And now I'm very reluctant to go there because what I thought optimistically was going to be, the one country in Africa which you could say, well, this is great, it's going to succeed. You've got to think now, is it? And I don't want to go and photograph negatives, particularly. Not in that sense, anyway, not on a project I've worked on for a long time.
So it was the idealism of the revolution that kept you going? The struggle?
In a way, it was kind of interesting to see how it would wind up. And it's also an interesting place. And I kept getting magazines, amazingly, who would pay me to go there. And, I went for Geo, German Geographic, a couple of times. So I had to shoot stuff for them. But at the same time, you look for a picture for yourself. And I think that's what we still do, really. You might pay me tomorrow to go to Timbuktu, and I'll think, okay, I've got to shoot a couple of spreads for the Sunday Times.
I'll think about it.
But I might get a picture for myself, And that's it, really. We just go on shooting.
Yeah, I think the point I'd like to make was that, the best photography is where you're personally involved. Look at Kudelka. His country was being invaded by the Russians. He was involved. I think the strength of what Ian did in South Africa is because he was involved. I think for photography to be, I've never seen photography as a job. It's something I love doing. But you have to kind of integrate it into your life. And that's why I think, there's things in this room I'd want to photograph. There are no limits to, how you can create a good picture. But I think the key thing is to, it's got to be quite an instinctive part of your life, and you've got to really care about the subject. I think a lot of news photography can be very generic, even though it somehow gets the message across. It doesn't touch you, but when you see it when it does, it's quite incredible. I looked at the Time blog yesterday. They had the best pictures from Syria, or the best, and it was absolutely heartbreaking, seeing that, the tragedy unfolding.
I think the thing about Kudelka is that it helped that he was a lunatic.
Yeah.
Just amazing, actually. I was the only guy to get into Prague, and I was shooting with a Leica under my coat, and you'd photograph the Russians, and they would kind of shoot above you and so forth, and then they'd chase you. And I sort of would run down the street, and the Czechs were terrific. They would try and block the guy chasing you, and someone would drag you into a doorway. So I was being very discreet and very careful about what I was doing. Kudelka was there with a couple of old Dixers on a string, and he would walk straight up to them and photograph them in their faces. I didn't have the guts to do that. And I have to say, he got better pictures than I did. So all I got out of it after 4 days was being very hungry, because there was, I didn't have anything to eat for 4 days. I was in the best hotel, they closed the restaurant, and believe me, after, I don't know how people go on hunger strikes, after 4 days, I was feeling it. I just wanted to get out, never mind Parametri's deadline, you know.
But I photographed after Poland a year later, when they had martial law. The only place we could stay was the Intercontinental, and it had this amazing grand piano with guys with tails, and the only thing on the menu was steak tartare. So we lived on steak tartare with David Burnett and a few other American photographers. And then, because the taxis had gone on strike, our transportation was the tourist horse and cart, sort of with a blanket and everything. It was, yeah. Anyway.
Any more questions?
Hi, thank you. What advice might you have for aspiring photojournalists, especially in this digital media age?
Ooh, ouch. I honestly, I mean, I get young photographers coming up and saying, what should I be doing? And my answer is, if you know, tell me. Because, you know, until we find a way of making the web pay so that we can actually go out and shoot for the web, it's going to be tricky. I mean, the Sunday Times won't be here in 10 years. I'm afraid, you know. So we've got to find new ways of working. Good young photographers will always survive, whatever they do. But it's a very competitive market. You know, you go somewhere, and wherever you are in the world, there's a guy in front of you, or 10 people in front of you holding up their phones. And you've got to kick them out of the way these days. So it's quite, it is tricky. Sometimes it works. I mean, the only picture I remember from the election was a picture that Elliot Erwitt took, and he arrived late at the event. And I guess one was there in the distance, but there are 100 phones in front, all being held up with this picture on the phone. And it's the only picture I remember of the, you know, of the election. So, but you can't, as a young photographer, depend on getting that picture. You can't always depend on arriving late and being in a good position. You know, it's, you know, ask Paolo. He's better than I am at doing things. You know, he knows today, and even as a famous photographer, it's not easy. It really isn't. Sorry, I'd like to be, you know, more optimistic. But,
I mean, I'm going to also, you know, throw into the conversation. We touched a little bit earlier about the changing aesthetics of conflict photography, and you know, we talked a little bit earlier, and Peter referred to the fact that for him it was a moment. It was a moment in which he decided maybe to leave behind something that was a more direct, more sort of in the moment type of photography, and then start to look sort of for aesthetics that is much more considered in a way. And what we were discussing earlier is that, of course, you know, at the moment you have got people photographing in the moment, that they are not photographers, but because they happen to be there. They might be the executioners, but that picture is going to be very relevant. Now, that's a reality. We cannot compete with that, and a photographer cannot compete with that. But also it kind of opens to a new way of thinking about documentary photography and the new aesthetics that you might want to approach. Also, it's very competitive because there are a lot of photographers. That's fine, you know, but we have got that kind of immediacy that comes from the phones, that come from the people that's there, that come. I mean, we're discussing Iraq and the Iraq War, and we're discussing that the most iconic pictures come from the soldiers that were in, you know, in Abu Ghraib. So you are never going to be able to compete with that, and that's the reality. But I think it opens for a kind of exploration of photographers, and I think there is a very interesting debate, and I think it's a very interesting way in which documentary photography is being approached in many different ways, that still conflict is very relevant to be documented, but there are many ways that you can approach it, and maybe just being there, getting that picture in the middle of the conflict, which is very direct language, is not going to be the easiest way of the future, but doesn't mean that there are not so many platforms. I mean, we are saying that 50 years ago, it was the Sunday Times magazine. Now you have got so many different platforms and so many different ways in which your photography can be seen, can be explored, that I think it's just not to narrow it, it's just to be quite ambitious with what you want to do with it. I always said, aim for the highest and then you start to kind of put it there and not have just one specific aim that is, I want to publish just in the Sunday Times magazine, because that is narrowing yourself and restricting yourself. That is what we were discussing earlier.
Good. John's been sitting here so patiently. I think you should say something.
To photographers, no, I get out there and do it. That's what people are doing, and they're doing it in a variety of ways. With no money, in a sense, being a freelancer has never really changed. You're always starving, and you're always getting hustled and exploited by the publications. Now it's a little more. It's more of a kind of moral quandary, I think, for photo editors, particularly because there are so many youngsters out there with iPhones or cameras and trying to have a go, trying to make a break of it, and it's really dangerous now. A lot of photographers, particularly, have been getting killed or wounded, and in some cases captured. In this new, very hostile environment that the world has become, the stakes are much higher. It was never safe to cover conflict. Susan, who's here, covered the Nicaraguan Revolution, and she can attest to that. It's always dangerous, but now it's much more so, I think. And maybe there's more people out there.
I think the difference is in the era you're talking about, the journalist, the photographer was actually welcome. In a lot of places now they aren't.
The problem is, in some of the conflicts we now have in the world, there's everybody's cynical now. There's no more, it's like I was saying earlier, I think even revolutionaries have an idea of how they should look like, or how it should be. People go through the motions of things they've seen on the movies now, actually, in war. In some cases, some of the African guerrillas I've seen, they definitely behave the way they have seen people acted out on the screen. And I think there's nowhere you can go without someone having a sense of you nowadays. There's no more virgin territory in that sense. And so the pitch is queered in a sense. And with the rise of extreme Islamism, I think we've now seen, just one point.
Yeah, sure.
We've now seen journalists, Western journalists in particular, become an arm in the conflict, become potential booty. 30 years ago there were no snuff videos. It was an invention, and nowadays they exist.
Just to come back on that, do you think on the flip side of that, John, that there is, there's a kind of uniform of the revolutionary? Do you think on the flip side of that, there's the photographers are actually doing the same thing?
Well, it's not a thought I've given a huge amount of time to, but I do think that there is this idea of a kind of an architecture that's been built up, a kind of body of work. So I think that 20 years ago, or maybe even very recently, if you're a young photographer going out somewhere, you'd have a sense of who your mentors are, your reference points. Susan's work, Ian's work, Peter's work. You'd have a sense of what boxes you needed to tick in order to narrate visually that conflict, that phenomenon. But I think now, with the advent of the YouTube videos, the camera phone videos, and all the many ways in which we're seeing reality, coming also from citizen journalists and people who just happen to be there. I think perhaps now maybe that architecture changes. Maybe there's not quite the same boxes to tick. I don't know. I think it's an open question. Do you just go and do your thing? Do you have your project and go? Do you actually go to a conflict and then just cover one aspect of it? Or do you do it in the same all-encompassing way you did before? I don't know. These are the things I think, it's funny, I'm not a photographer, but I'm a writer, and I've worked with many, many photographers over the years, and most of the time in war zones. So, and I do think visually. So I'm kind of aware of the same conceptual issues. And in fact, in a sense, it's the same thing for words. How do you continue to write in a way that engages people and tells them something that's original and is worthwhile? It's the same. It's exactly the same challenge. So in a way, it's all merging too. The challenge is the same. I think the need is still there. It's a question of how you do it. And I think, what I was saying at the beginning is I think there's a distressing aspect to what's happening today. When I was last in Syria with the rebels, I found photographers who were there because they didn't have any other way to make a living. I met one guy who was older than me who'd never been out of Spain before and had gone to Syria, never been to a war zone. He may have been out of Spain. That's an exaggeration. He'd never been to a war zone. But he had worked his entire career for a provincial Spanish paper, which had folded, like everything in Spain is folding. And so he was literally accompanying a writer from one of the major Spanish papers, which is also imploding as we speak, in the hopes and with the understanding from his colleague that if he wrote a story, there was a likelihood that if he was near him, they might buy a picture. But there was no guarantee, and he was risking his life. And he was conscious of risking his life. And I didn't think that, in his case, that it was right that he was there. I think it was brave of him to be there, and I think, he didn't have a need to be in Syria. He didn't want to be there. He wasn't interested in that particular conflict. This was about surviving, with the tools that he knew how to survive with. So there's that going on. And then there's the youngsters with iPhones who are just trying to do it, and who can fault them for it? But on the other hand, there's a real, I think, a question about, and it's come up in a couple of cases. I've had editors ask me whether they should publish words and pictures of certain freelancers who might be risking their lives for that, because and they're not getting really anything in exchange, except maybe their little moment in the sun, and it's pretty ephemeral these days. But it sure ain't for the money, because the money has it's shrunk, 50-fold. I don't know how you can't possibly live on what they might pay you for a picture they're going to use on a website, or you just can't. So it's however, it's a big world, and there's lots of ways to be creative in it. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
You've got,
We can take a couple of more questions. Yeah.
You made a very interesting point early on when you said that it's the passion and the commitment as a professional for yourself, and to be totally engaged in the subject matter that you're undertaking to photograph and chronicle and so on. And the separation between a professional that's thinking about what you're photographing, how you're perceiving it, the emotive connection that you have with the people, compared to the citizens photographers. Everyone's got an iPhone. Everyone can snap away, where a professional perhaps is looking at, how am I going to tell the story in a way that touches the emotional buttons? What message do I want to communicate to? And that, I would think, starts to isolate. It doesn't bring any more money to the coffer, but it isolates the kind of thinking and the intelligence that is published, if it is ever published. But being committed to do it, just being there because you you are looking at what the people's struggles are and caring deeply about it and wanting to tell a story that has truth, that has gravitas to it, and can illuminate to the wider world what's happening. The separation, how do you feel between the citizen's approach with his iPhone, which we all have, or in a variety of different ways, versus how you approach going into...
Well, I think that raises an important, question for us as an organisation, not just Magnum, but anyone working in the photography world. It's all changed, and I think the jury is still very much out on where this is going to shake out. I think there's still room to, there's lots of ways of communicating and giving over that message if it's something that you personally are really involved with. Doesn't have to be. There are lots of ways of doing it. Taking a picture on an iPhone is as valid as taking it on something else. And sometimes I think, why am I carrying this camera around when I've got an iPhone? And it's a real headbanger for me, that one, because actually the bloody thing takes reasonable pictures. But I think the best, my introduction to photography was through a guy. I shared a room with a photographer's brother, Chris Killip. I was at university with him, who's a well-known photographer now, professor at Harvard. And I used to push him about how can I be a photographer? And all he said was, best advice I've ever had was just go and take pictures. And whatever I said to him, he'd just come back with that, go and take pictures. So I think that, I don't think it's healthy to have too much of your heart on your sleeve. And what I was trying to get across earlier, probably not very well, was that, I stopped worried about describing events and I just tried to experience things. And the photography just flows from that. And there are moments, there are certain times, certain days in the year when you really, really look forward to what you're going to see that day. And that is amazing. I mean, I'm sure, John, you experienced that as well. I mean, I wouldn't dream of going to Syria. Perhaps if I was really passionate about the situation, I might do, but, I just feel it's too dangerous. But do you think that's an adequate description of what you like about writing, about... Sorry.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Actually, if I can...
Well, when was the last time you woke up being excited about what you were going to see that day?
Oh, I was always excited in Syria every day. There's a certain level of excitement that accrues in a place like that. But I'd like to hear what you have to say.
No, I was just going to add a rider. I mean, being committed ain't enough. You've got to have an eye as well. And there are, thousands of people out there who are committed, but if they don't have an eye,
That's right.
why bother?
Monica, you see a lot of photography, don't you? So what's your perception of the way things are going?
Well, that's the summary of what I was saying before. I try not to focus on the negatives and try to see, sort of no answers, but a way forward. And I think, of course, there is a massive competition, and there is a massive competition with the immediacy of photography that these days you get not only from the citizens that happen to be there in the right moment, but also from photographers that they have got the infrastructure of the wires or whatever, just to be there, just shooting. So when I think that they come to the traditional documentary photographers, is to try to think beyond and start to find sort of a language and aesthetics that they go just beyond the newspaper, that it was where traditionally this photography had been seen, and start just kind of to think, well, there are many platforms, there are many ways of these days conveying, conflict that aesthetically can go in many places. It's not just about having the book. It's the idea that, they see very comfortably in a gallery, they see very comfortably in someone's sitting room. Still the message is there, and I think it's very valid. But the aesthetics kind of change, and you find your way sort of forward with a photography. It's about, putting your elements of a documentary photographer and just trying to think I'm going to apply this, but I'm going to just don't have to be in the middle of Aleppo just waiting for, for the, bullets to go through, because you can actually document Syria without actually going to Syria.
Yeah, I just wanted to, exactly. I just was in Venezuela for a couple of weeks with a very young and gifted photographer who spent the last 2 years basically photographing homeless people in northeastern Brazil who lived in an abandoned chocolate factory. And, I think it was an intuitive process for him, and he found himself as a creative individual there in that project. A number of things resonated for him that, it just worked. His social, political, and his creative sensibility clicked there. And he realized that he needed to give it time and work through his ideas, some of which were conscious and some weren't. And in the end, it happens to be photographic, but it could have been in words, it might have been poetry, it could have been in sculpture. It's really about knowing what your idea is. And so going back to, I think it was you that asked what to say to a young photographer, it would be the same for any young creative individual. It's like Monica says, for some of us we're moths to the flame. We need the action, and that's fine. We need those sorts of people. We need news photography. We need to know what's happening. We need the wires. We need that. We need the news bulletin. But if you have an additional or another creative urge, a disquiet that propels you, sometimes you don't know what it is, but you can find it. And it's good to know that you need an idea to dig deeper, and that you don't necessarily need to be there, always right there in the front with everybody else. I remember doing that when I was young and not really feeling right. I didn't know what my idea was. I didn't know what the problem was that I needed to resolve. But I did it by instinct, by eventually finding it, by eventually finding out that by giving things time and going repeatedly and trying to understand things that I couldn't understand, that I was unlocking essential existential questions I had that led me through life. And they became my story, the story I want to tell. It's like what they say about a novelist. But the trick is finding out what that thing is. And that can give you quite a bit of peace, because it can help you clear the road. You don't necessarily have to hustle in quite the same way. And you can starve and be happy for a while, knowing that you have this thing you're exploring and wanting to find, even if you don't quite know what it is yet. Yeah, that's it.
One more question, and then we can.
I think my question was about going back to what, apart from the photographer, what the photography itself is and represents. I mean, obviously, when this was taken in terms of years ago, it was about the truth and telling the truth about a situation that otherwise others wouldn't see. And today, of course, photographers and amateurs with their phones do the same. But obviously, I wonder, now that amateurs do have more of a say with their telephones or in portraying the news, what does this mean? Where is the difference in the kind of photography, if there is any, that there is today with a photograph of Gaddafi, or to one portrayed by the photographer years ago, if there is anything? Because of course, by the photographer, there's also a filter, a culture background, a photography background, and everything. I was wondering if that portrays or comes out in the kind of photograph, apart from aesthetical reasons, that, if that does come out.
That was a very long question.
Sorry.
I think there's a risk of over-intellectualizing photography. We're not brain surgeons. And I don't know. I mean, if you're interested in a subject and you pursue it, the actual business of taking the picture The only intellectual bit is getting yourself into the right place in the first place. I mean, Cartier-Bresson once summed it up very well for me. And he said, look, you know, all photography is about, it's like shooting a gun. You get yourself into the situation, you wait for the image to come together and the moment to come together, and you pull the trigger. And
it does shape people's mind in a way. I mean, we do have a clear image of what the photographs that Cartier-Bresson has taken and how they've shaped our vision of a specific time. So
I take photographs for me, not for you. And I want to tell the story as best I can, in as good a way as shape of a picture. You can have 300 people with their telephones there, and if Paolo is there with his camera, he will get the moment that nobody else has, and that's what counts. You know, is the eye and the ability to wait for the moment to say what you want to say. Obviously, you're not happy with that.
no, it's just that I could sit here arguing about it like for hours, and I don't want to.
No, I'm sorry. It's I don't think we want to over-intellectualize it. You know, it's a great way of passing your life. But we're not brain surgeons, and you know, you've just got to get into something that interests you. Do it as best you can. But sorry.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been great. So they are going to be signing books. The books are here, they will be signing, and the drinks are at the back.
Yeah.